Okay, so when I say Roman Empire, what's the first date that pops into your head? For most people, it's the year it all came crashing down. But what if I told you that's not the end of the story? Not even close. What if Rome had a secret second act, an empire that kept the flame alive for another 1,000 years? Well, let's head east and uncover the incredible story of Byzantium.
Yep, I'm willing to bet this is the date you were thinking of, 476 AD. This one year is burned into our minds as the end of an era.
Right, this is what we all learned in school. It's the year the last Roman emperor in the West was kicked off his throne and Europe supposedly tumbled into the Dark Ages. It's a nice, clean, simple ending.
But history is almost never that simple. Because while 476 marks the end of Rome in the West, that's only half the story. The other half of the Roman Empire, the eastern half, was still very much alive and kicking.
This is where things get really interesting. Let's peel back the layers and see how Rome didn't actually die out, but was carried forward for a whole other millennium.
So to really get this, we got to jump back in time a bit. Long before the West collapsed, way back in 330 AD, Emperor Constantine the Great had a brilliant idea. He created a new capital for the empire in the east, a city he called Constantinople, the New Rome. So when the old Rome finally fell apart, the center of gravity, the real power of the empire, had already shifted. It didn't fall, it just moved.
Now this is a super important point. We call them the Byzantine Empire today, but that's a name historians came up with centuries later. They never called themselves that. To themselves, to their enemies, to everyone at the time, they were just the Roman Empire. As far as they were concerned, Rome never fell at all.
And they didn't just survive. They absolutely thrived. In fact, they reached this incredible peak under one of their absolute greatest emperors, a guy named Justinian.
Justinian was a man on a mission. He was going to put the old empire back together. He launched these enormous building projects, like the Hagia Sophia, still one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. He took centuries of messy Roman laws and organized them into one single coherent system. That's so important, it's still the foundation for a lot of legal systems today. And his generals, they went out and reconquered huge chunks of the old empire, including Italy itself.
I mean, can you imagine? For a brief, shining moment, it looked like he was going to pull it off. Roman eagles were flying over North Africa and Italy again. It really seemed like the fall of the West was just a temporary blip.
But then, disaster struck. A horrifying plague swept through, killing millions. Famine followed. And the constant wars were just relentless. The dream of a reunified Rome was shattered, and the empire was forced to shrink back just to fight for its own survival.
But even after that, the story is far from over. In fact, what they managed to pull off next is maybe the most incredible part of their entire story. A 1,000-year saga of survival against all odds.
Just let that number sink in. For over 1,000 years after the Western Empire was a distant memory, Byzantium held on. That's a longer run than most of the famous empires in history, and pretty much every single day was a struggle.
And they were fighting, well, pretty much everybody. They were this Christian island in a sea of rivals. They fought off the Persian Empire to the east, the unstoppable wave of the Arab caliphates from the south, and eventually the Ottoman Turks. But maybe the most shocking threat came from the west, from people who were supposed to be their friends.
And that brings us to the beginning of the end. It wasn't an old enemy that delivered the fatal blow, but fellow Christians. After centuries of holding the line against impossible odds, the constant pressure started to show. The foundations of the empire, once so strong, began to crack. You know how it goes. The endless wars just drained the treasury dry. Corruption started to rot the government from the inside out, and the economy was in serious trouble. The mighty empire was becoming a ghost of its former self.
And in the year 1204, the empire suffered a wound from which it would never recover.
This is one of the most shameful events in history. The Knights of the Fourth Crusade were supposed to be passing through on their way to the Holy Land. Instead, they turned their armies on their Christian allies in Constantinople. They sacked the richest city in the world, and the Byzantine Empire was shattered. It never, ever truly got back on its feet after that. But even then, even after being broken and humiliated, the empire refused to die. It limped on for another 250 years, setting the stage for one of the most heroic and tragic last stands in all of history. For 53 days, a handful of defenders held the massive walls of Constantinople against the entire Ottoman army, who had brought a new superweapon with them, giant cannons that could smash stone to dust. They weren't just fighting for their city, they were fighting for the last surviving piece of the Roman world.
But it couldn't last forever. On May 29, 1453, the legendary walls were finally breached, and the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, rode his horse into the city.
And what about the last Roman emperor, Constantine XI? In a final, incredible act of defiance, he tore off his royal purple robes and charged into the thick of the fighting, dying anonymously alongside his men. And with him, a line of Roman emperors stretching all the way back to Augustus finally came to an end.
So why does this forgotten empire even matter? Because for 1,000 years, Byzantium acted as a shield for the rest of Europe. It protected and preserved all the knowledge of the ancient world, Greek philosophy, Roman law, all the things that would eventually spark the Renaissance. It was the bridge that carried the classical world over the Dark Ages and into our own.
Which brings us right back to where we started. When did Rome really fall? Was it in 476, with a whimper in the west? Or was it almost 1,000 years later, in 1453, in a blaze of glory on the walls of Constantinople? The answer to that question really changes the way you look at history.